Welcome everyone to ACCP's CSR Marketplace virtual program, and specifically for this afternoon session, Words Matter, Driving Social Impact with Inclusive Language, hosted by Pact with Purpose. My name is Jean Metzger. I'm ACCP's Vice President of Membership Marketing and Communications, and I'm so glad you were able to join us today. For those of you who may be new to ACCP, the Association of Corporate Citizenship Professionals is the premier membership organization working to improve the effectiveness of corporate social impact professionals. We connect our members to the people, knowledge, and resources they need to enhance their impact in their companies and in their communities. Before we get started, I would like to remind everyone that this is just one of several sessions that we are hosting this week. Sorry, Barbara, can you advance the slides? That's not working for me. Thank you. This is just one session of several that we're hosting this week as part of CSR Marketplace Virtual. We do encourage you to register for the remaining programs. All of them are being recorded, and all the recordings will be shared with all the people who had registered for them. Before we get started, I also like to remind everyone of a couple of ACCP programs. The webcast, our next webcast is on September 28th, Driving Long-Term CSR Impact. And then our annual conference is in just a few weeks in Denver, Colorado, which we're very excited, and hopefully we'll see some of you there. The conference is at full capacity at the moment, but we do have a wait list, so you can be added to the wait list if there's interest in attending. And finally, our Impact Measurement Summit will be happening in early December on December 5 and 6, and registration for that program will be opening next week. Now for just a couple quick webcast housekeeping items. We have enabled Zoom transcript and closed captioning for today's webcast, so we encourage you to use that feature. We also have enabled Zoom chat, and we encourage you to engage with the participants and your fellow and the panelists through the Zoom chat. And then finally, please ask your questions throughout the program in the Q&A section. We will be keeping an eye on that throughout the program, and we'll be pausing at the end to make sure we answer everyone's questions. And with that, I'm very pleased to pass the program to Leeatt Rothschild of Pact with Purpose.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And it's wonderful to see some faces, but know that there are many of you on the call. We're thrilled to be having this conversation with you. So to kick us off, what I would love to do is to introduce my esteemed panelist, the individual who's going to be joining me in this wonderful conversation, Perry Yeatman. Some of you may be familiar with Perry, others of you may not. So I'm going to share a little bit about, Perry's background, just so you can have that as context as we go into today's webinar. So Perry is an esteemed high impact executive. Her career has spanned different sectors, from business to government to philanthropy, many geographies from Asia to Russia to Europe. She's had a multitude of functional roles, from marketing to HR to general management, and she has had a wonderful foray into different organizations. Today, Perry is joining us as the head of corporate for Save the Children, and this current role, she develops and delivers innovative, sustainable, and scalable partnerships with leading corporations, likely a role that speaks to many of you that are on the call. Prior to joining Save the Children, Perry was SVP of Corporate and Government Affairs at Kraft Foods and was also the president of the Kraft Foods Foundation. And before joining Kraft, Perry was the vice president of corporate affairs for Unilever North America. In addition to her day jobs, Perry is an award-winning author. She's a frequent blogger and vlogger, and she's a board member and a staunch advocate for women and girls. And she also heads up her own social enterprise that she's passionate about, called Your Career, Your Terms. Thrilled to have Perry join. Just a little me. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Packed with Purpose. We're a corporate gifting company with a social impact, and we help companies send wonderful gifts to their clients, employees, board members that really delight and impress, because the products in our gift boxes change lives. So that's a little bit about me. What I would love to do, given that this conversation is all about the power of words, is to almost do a forced rewind. I just shared a number of, wonderful professional accolades that Perry has. I gave you a short snippet of who I am. But thinking about the power of words, what I would love to do is, I'm going to actually start with you, Perry. And I would love for you to introduce yourself using a different angle, maybe a more intimate angle, thinking about the power of words and how that can provide a different context for the individuals on this call to know who you are and the perspective that you might be bringing to this conversation.
Yeah, I'm first of all, I'm just delighted to be here as someone who has spent the better part of 40 years really focused on words as the way to drive action, behavior, outcomes. I couldn't think of a more relevant topic for us to be having, because it really does. I used to think of communication as successful communication was think, feel, or do something different because you experienced that communication. So for me, yes, I have spent a lot of my life being a professional, and I feel incredibly blessed by the career that I've had, spanning sectors, continents, etc. But if I was to think about what I am first and foremost, the first word that I would say is I'm a mom, right? I have two amazing kids, and I feel very blessed to be able to be their mom. I am somebody who's absolutely committed to making an impact, right? I mean, we talk about that, but it's not just professional, it's personal. For me, it is every day. How can I make something better? How can I change somebody's life? How can I, whether it's like leaving a bigger tip or just being kind or whatever, it's like, I think it really, to me, life is not a spectator sport. You have to come at it, and you have to participate every day. So I'd say I'm a mom. I am a heavy duty participant in life, trying to drive some positivity in the world. I also think that, I'm somebody who says, for me, it's very important to kind of say what others won't say, right? There's a lot of conversations where there's an elephant in the room and people won't speak, or they can't speak for themselves. So I think that the roles that I've taken and the way that I am in the world is also about being an advocate for others, and trying to give a voice to those who may not have a voice. So I will stop there, but those are, oh, actually, can I just add my latest title, which I am excited about,
Yes.
is fiance. So there you go. You can be a post 50 person and still find romance and love. So I am recently now also a fiance, and I'm trying to learn that role.
Amazing. I love it. Yes, hearts galore. All right. Well, if I had to reintroduce myself, I would say I am an entrepreneur. I'm committed to using my personal and professional skills and passions to creating broad social impact. I am the mother of 4 kids. And although this feels like it's receded a bit, lately I have been a caregiver to different family members who are living with cancer. So hopefully that's just, a way to have you get to know us a little bit more, and also to pique our brains in thinking about how the way in which, we present ourselves, our organizations, the words that we use, how they actually might impact others, intentionally or not. So to kick us off, I would love to share this quote by Maria Montessori. Words are the natural means of expressing thoughts and establishing understanding between people. Sometimes we don't necessarily think about the power of words and what they're intended to do. And I think this is a really nice way for us just to think about how words can be used intentionally and with, the intended outcome on behalf of an organization. All right. To kick us off in our conversation, would love to spend a few minutes talking about this idea between intent and impact. So, and sometimes it might be easiest to think about this from a personal relationship perspective, whether you've got a life partner, you have children, you have siblings, or in the professional context. But if we think about it, we might all have a particular intent with the words that we're using, whether it is an employee handbook, whether it is communication to our clients or our partners, whether it is how we are referring to different policies. And we know that our intent might be one thing and the impact might be aligned, but the impact could actually be something totally different than what we had even anticipated, or what we hope to achieve. And so, just a few things that I think will be helpful for us to think about. Language is so powerful, and it can create, obviously positive impact, what we intend for it to have, but also unintended consequences. Sometimes ones that we've premeditated and thought about, and other times ones that we could have never foreseen. Also, especially with the rise of, companies just being much more purposeful, having there be a spotlight on the relationship between companies and their employees, companies and their supply chain, companies and their partners or their clients. Companies in general, organizations are embedding purpose in their organizations to bring those values to life through a lot of different ways. Business leaders, both executives, and I would say, individual contributors, managers, people within organizations are really exploring the language that they use and thinking about how it can achieve their desired outcome. And then another thing that I want to share is sometimes there's, let's call it like episodic projects, right? So there's like a focal point to think about a particular language that an organization is using. And oftentimes, once that's done, the process of reevaluating or revisiting language that's used for a handbook, for a policy, for, a campaign, a project, whatever it might be, is just not revisited. So I want to pause here and Perry, have you share, some of your thoughts or reactions to this idea of intent versus impact.
Yeah, I think it's in fact the world is getting, as we get more multicultural and multidimensional and work and personal lines blur. I honestly think this intent versus impact is getting more important, and it's also getting a bit trickier, right? So when I think, I'll just give you a couple examples, because as leaders, and I think everyone in an organization needs to think of themselves as a leader. Our number one job is actually change. It's to lead the organization forward, because the idea of kind of staying the same is no longer, if it ever was, I'm not sure it was, but it is definitely no longer a way to stay in business, if you will. So it's all about leading change. And when you think about leading change, people have to understand where you're trying to go. So I'm going to give you two language examples. One is personal and one is professional. When I joined Save the Children after 30 plus years in business, one of the things I very intentionally said was, and I joined as the head of corporate, and people said, what is that, right? It's a good question. I had the same question myself. But to me, a lot of people said it's a fundraising team. That's where we sit. We're in development. And to me, I said, no, we're not fundraising. Fundraising has a very clear connotation, and it has a history, and it tends to mean, or people think it means, that you are asking somebody for money to go do what you're going to do, right? Or what your mission is. And while that still can happen, what we are trying to do at Save the Children, and the change I as a leader was trying to drive, was really to say, I don't want handouts. I want to look for win-win-win partnerships. So I want to be a strategic alliance builder between our mission and the heart of a company. So there are certain industries, certain companies where what they do as their core business is could be or is critical to us achieving our mission. So I'm looking for those linkages. So just changing the words, when people ask me, what do? I never say I'm a fundraiser. I never will say I'm a fundraiser, because I'm not. I'm a strategic alliance builder. And that has driven a very different mindset, both with our partners and with our people. And it's working because we are developing bigger, broader, deeper relationships with companies. Personally, I will say, and back to the intent versus impact, this is one as a mom with a newly disabled teen. So when you face a situation like that, you are trying very hard to validate your child, right, in their experience of the world. And you also don't know what to do necessarily, right? So you're asking questions, you're reading the literature, you're trying to figure out what to say, what to do, how do you empower them? How do you make them feel heard? And lots of people said to me, oh no, you cannot say disabled child. That is negative. That is, whether special needs. I got tons of advice on like what not to say about my child, right? For tons of reasons. But at the end of the day, my child said to me, Mom, I am a disabled person. I don't want to be a person with disabilities. I don't want to be thought less of. But she had a very clear preferred nomenclature. And the thing I want to say about this is, and this is why it's so tricky, and it's the same with names, right? I had a dinner this week earlier with somebody whose child is they, right? And their preferred pronoun is they. You've got to think about not only what is the institution trying to do, like instead of being fundraisers, we're strategic alliance builders, you have to operate at that personal level too. What is the name? What is the identifier that somebody cares about? Because using the right one with my daughter makes her feel validated and empowered. And using the wrong one, even if it's the one society feels more comfortable with, doesn't. So there's this individual perspective that's really important. And again, it really is. Are you driving using the words you use? Are you driving desired actions? Think, feel, or do something different because of the communication. And a lot of times we get it wrong. But if you're open to hearing what is being interpreted from what you're saying, and you're willing to adapt, then you'll be successful. People will respect that.
I love those examples. Those are great. Let's take this as an opportunity to bring up two other examples. One maybe in the pop culture world that some of you might be familiar with, and another one that is more in the non-for-profit cause-focused area. So this was now a few years ago. Some of you, if you're Lizzo fans, I know that there's recent news about Lizzo's, but for those of you that may remember, Lizzo launched a new song, and in her song, she unintentionally used an ableist slur. And as soon, once the song was launched, there was a lot of backlash. Lizzo immediately apologized. So she took, she was open to listening, to realizing that, a song that she, put out there that she thought was going to be met with positivity actually had negative unintended consequences, right? So this idea between intent versus impact. So the first thing she was receptive to feedback, which I would actually say is such an important precursor, because whether you are working within the, a particular department within your organization, whether you're partnering with folks in marketing, partnering with, other executives, partnering with those that are outside of your team, just being receptive to hearing that the language that you're using might merit review, I think is the first step, and is not an easy one. Whether it's you or many of you might be nodding saying, this isn't my problem. This is something that I'm facing internally within my organization. So, Lizzo was open to the feedback. She immediately apologized on social media and went so far as course correcting. She, remixed the song, taking out the ableist slur, and changed the lyrics so that it would, really speak to and say, I heard you loud and clear. So I feel like the takeaways here is, be open to the feedback, really own the mistake. And in this case, like, she was so sincere, so authentic, and she took action. Another example is, so we're based here in Chicago. There's a local social enterprise called Sweet Beginning, and they individuals were involved and help them to establish a pathway to self-sufficiency, to reintegrating into society, and really feeling, more stable with their emergence as, citizens of their community. And they had a program that was called the Ex-Offender Program. This is a social enterprise, right? So a non-for-profit at their core. And they called this program the Ex-Offender Program. Turns out, all of these individuals that were formerly incarcerated, right? Individuals that were justice involved were saying, why are you calling this program the Ex-Offender Program, right? Like, that is literally the identity I'm trying to shed. And your purpose in being is to help me reintegrate into society. It's helping me see that there is a bright future, a new sweet beginning to reintegrating as a citizen of my community. And so, through this feedback, they realized that there was a lot of stigma associated with the original name. They were open to the feedback of their constituents, the audience that they were serving, and they ended up changing the name of the program to U-Turn Permitted. And I love this example because even in the most well-meaning organizations, a social enterprise, a non-for-profit at its core, right? Even corporate professionals within an organization, we might be using language that is demeaning, offensive, has certain stigmas, and or is repelling the very stakeholders or audience members that we want to bring in. And it's just an opportunity to consider the negative implications of language and to use human-centered terms, or to take the opportunity to make sure that the language that we're using is not offensive. What I would love to do now, especially as we've got some of these examples that are hopefully piquing some of your ideas in terms of what, the language you're using internally, is to actually launch a poll so that we can get a pulse check on how folks here, on this call actually have their organizations think about language. So if you could take this poll, how does your organization incorporate and evaluate its inclusive language? Right? So do you not know? Marketing handles it because it's a communications thing. Oh, actually, if it's inclusive language, CSR is in charge. No, actually, this is something that, spans across departments, or none of the above. And, we'll keep this open for another moment. It would be great to see where everyone lands. And I know that from our experience, having spoken to other organizations, because this is something that's really been top of mind that we've been working on, it's always interesting to see where the results net out. So wonderful. So a little less than a third of folks on this call don't know. Cross-department effort is the majority, which is great to see, given the importance of having different perspectives, right? The whole idea behind this is making sure that we're using language that drives towards the outcomes, the actions, the intentions that our organization has. And what better way to do that than by making sure that, different departments are weighing in.
If I could add, that's exactly right. Like, when you think about purpose, this discussion is around purpose and the power of words and purpose, et cetera. Your purpose is basically made up of two things. It is what you say and what you do. And it is every person, every interaction, every day. That's what drives your purpose. It either lives or dies, either gets delivered or it gets pushed against, right? Like, the experience of the person is, this is not at all how these people are living. And so I think when you think about it, it's got to be cross-departmental. It's got to be every level, every person, because that is how purpose lives and how it becomes the way a company actually is perceived and kind of goes through its core activities. So I was delighted to see that so many of you, that is the way you're doing it, because it's the only way. It's the only way to really have a purpose be the centerpiece, as opposed to a frame or something that's on the wall that nobody actually does anything about. It doesn't live, it doesn't drive your outcomes. Yep.
Yeah, I agree. And thanks, Jenna, for sharing the comment in the chat, because knowing that it's cross-departmental, is one thing, but also knowing, who takes the first step, who takes the second step is another way to think about, how alive is the language in terms of how often is it being evaluated, and how interconnected are the departments in our organizations in making sure that language is achieving the outcomes that we want to create. And I think, Jenna, you're not alone, where in many organizations, marketing, as really the owner of communications at large, is the one that is creating all of the language that's used, whether it's for internal purposes or for external purposes. And then, oftentimes folks within the CSR or social responsibility department, if that department exists, are the ones that are, policing it or scrutinizing it, coming in sometimes saying, well, I think we could do this better. So I think you're not alone in saying that. What I would love to do now is have you, Perry, share, let's call it almost like a mini case study of how you have seen language in action, specifically through the lens of Save the Children. And if there's another example or two from your past life, I think that would be great for you to share.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I'm going to keep this really brief because I want to get to your questions. I want to make sure we get you all, to be able to participate. But as I said, communication drives action, right? That's the way, think, feel, or do. Those are the outcomes of communication. Intended or not intended, verbal, nonverbal. That's what happens. So it matters. And when we started looking at Save the Children, there's several examples. I told you about the fundraising versus strategic alliances. Here's another one that actually impacted the entire organization. More recently in the United States and around the world, there have been discussions about the idea of like white saviorism. Are NGOs actually, are we perceived, and do we perceive ourselves as coming in and saying, we have the answers, we know what to do, we can solve your problem for you, right? Just listen to us, right? The thing is, that's actually not the answer to most of the problems, and that doesn't actually drive the type of sustainable, scalable, lasting impact that organizations like Save the Children are designed to do, right? What we really realized was, no, our mission is actually, as I said, to give a voice to those who don't necessarily have a voice. Children often don't have a public voice. They don't have a public voice in whether it's in policy making or even in their family necessarily. So it was how we actually looked at all the language we used, whether it was, beneficiaries, or whether it was, we used to do programmatic interventions. And we looked at all of the key language and we said, what is it we're actually trying to do? And how would we change this to really say, we are here to support and enable the change that the people that we serve actually would drive themselves, were they in a different situation? Meaning they are just as capable as we are. It just so happens that we live in a different place and at a different time. We are not currently experiencing a disaster, natural disaster, whatever. So we created a whole new lexicon, and I'm happy to share it. I actually put it on my LinkedIn recently. It was not rocket science, but it was things like you can see here, right? Is it, we're trying to help those poor people, versus it's a perfectly capable person just like you and me, but it's a person living in poverty, right? So that's really the kind of rethink what you're saying and how does that change what you're doing. I'll give you another example that's not a Save the Children example. It's one that was quite public, and it's from years ago when I was at Kraft. So we were trying to do an acquisition of the Cadbury chocolate company. And it turned into a hostile takeover. They did not want to be acquired. And they threw some really great language at us, right? The headlines in the UK were reading things like the plastic cheese company, we were going to destroy their company, et cetera. And, it's really hard to read that and not want to respond. But the truth is, if we were successful, we all realized that our CEO was going to become the CEO for the whole company. So there was no benefit. We were not going to throw mud back. There was no benefit to that. What we needed to do was to just keep hitting the core messages about better together, why we would be better together, how we thought the company would benefit by being part of Kraft Foods, et cetera. Instead of kind of dragging them also, instead of, Michelle Obama says it really well. When they go low, we went high. We just stayed high. We completed the deal. And what I think really mattered was that because we didn't get into, a sparring match, as we went forward, what we had said was the way we behaved. We actually did look at who was the best leader for the job. We didn't just pick Kraft leaders. We looked at all the decisions we made were consistent with that. This is a valuable part of our company now, and we are all one company, and we're going to make it work together. And to the point that even though it was a fight for many, many months, years later, one of the Cadbury family actually said that they felt that the company had done better under Kraft than they would have done independently, right? And I just thought, it showed the power of, we got the deal done. The key executives that we needed to stay, many of them stayed. We were able to build one company, and then within the time frame that we had laid out in our investment case, we had actually created a company that was stronger together. So it does matter. And I think that you need to always consider, what are you saying and what are people going to think and feel and do because of that?
Great examples. Thank you, Perry. I'm going to share an example from Packed with Purpose. So as I mentioned, we are a corporate gifting company with a social impact. So social impact, is part of our DNA. And as an aside, in our gifts, we've got custom curations where we source products from social enterprises and purpose-driven companies. We don't call the manufacturers of those products product suppliers. We intentionally affectionately refer to them as our impact partners. And there's a reason for that. It's because they truly are our partners in creating impact. If it wasn't for them, our gifts would not be able to have the profound impact on US communities and, to some extent, global communities. So that's one note. But the example that I want to share is our company, our organization scrutinized the lexicon that we use when we talk about our impact partners. And, the story behind this is, we had folks on, let's call it the marketing team, that were putting together communications about our impact partners and how we were referring to them. And traditionally, we use the term minority owned, impact partner. And basically an employee, raised their hand and said, maybe we should evaluate if this is the right term. I've been reading literature and, in other conversations or channels, I've seen that there's, basically like a door opening to saying minority owned might not be the right term. For some people it could be, but lots of people who, let's say the outside world is calling minority owned, don't self-identify as a minority. And so again, it's, who is creating the language? Who are you talking about? Perry, you just discussed this in terms of this sort of white saviorism concept, in terms of who's the protagonist, who's the recipient, in some way. And so the way that this unfolded internally, and I think that, at any organization, whether you're large or you're small, anytime there's change, it's difficult. Change in people, change in language, whatever it might be. And so, it's not trivial to think about how do you actually put this into practice, because that's half of the challenge. And so I want to share a little bit about how we put this into practice. An employee flagged this. Leadership team, I think this is something we might want to consider. What we decided to do was to get employee feedback. But beyond, employee feedback was important because they're on the front lines of speaking perhaps with our clients, with our impact partners. And, because we're an organization that's steeped in doing good, have their ears to some of these concepts. But beyond that, what was much more important was setting up one-on-one conversations. So, brief but in-depth interviews with our own impact partners, individuals who are Black, who identify as AAPI, who are Latina or Latino, and other industry experts that are focused in the diversity, equity, and inclusion world, so that we could understand from your perspective, what are your reactions to the term minority owned? Do you identify as that? How would you call yourself? Because in our marketing communications, I want to know should refer to respect. That was really helpful for us to understand, how our impact partners who identify as Black, Brown, Asian, Pacific Islander, Latino, Latina, etc., how do they identify themselves? And this is not to say that there's a perfect solution. In fact, the solution that we got to, I think, is imperfect. But in the world of an organization, it's hard to be perfect for everyone. And so we landed on saying diverse owned as, again, this sort of catch-all group, because in the world of marketing or in the world of communications, you can't have 1,000 asterisks. Or if you're trying to say one thing, it is hard to be able to succinctly communicate something with, 20 different qualifiers. And so we landed on diverse owned. But when we're speaking about individual impact partners who identify as, capital B, Black owned business or Black business owner, we will use the terminology that is most appropriate and that they self-identify. And so I wanted to share a little bit about how we went about doing that, because I think it's really important. It also demystifies, how complicated it can be. And I think the greatest takeaways from this example is the importance of creating a safe channel for employees. And in some cases, outside stakeholders to voice their concern or just to voice a different perspective. And then, speak to the audience that you're referring to, or speak to the stakeholders that could be impacted. Because if you're, doing this in a black box, you're not going to have the outcome that you want, and you're likely going to have unintended consequences. One other brief example that I want to share is actually a company. In this case, it happens to be Best Buy. Best Buy had created some anti-bias trainings for volunteers. That is the outcome of what they did. But the context that I want to share, was the following. Best Buy is a organization, is a company, used, their thousands of employees to engage in the communities that they were serving. And what they realized was that many of their employees, who happened to be the, corporate volunteers, they saw themselves as holding a particular power or privilege based on, the position that they had, and in the service of serving as a volunteer when they were working with disinvested communities. And what they realized was that it would be really important for their employees to come to these organizations with the right mindset, and that, the corporate partnerships team couldn't assume that employees were going to have the right mindset. They needed to provide some kind of training and context setting to set the organization up for success for all of these large scale volunteer events. And so what they had was mandatory anti-bias training for all of their potential volunteers to make sure that they set their, their teammates up, their colleagues up for success. And again, the takeaway here, and this goes back to, a conversation that we had when we first started, was, the idea between intent and impact. And here, the intent was all positive. And what they uncovered was that there was implicit bias, and that implicit bias unfortunately had the potential to have, unintended consequences, negative consequences, and to really almost discredit and to undo all of the positive impact that the team was creating through their corporate volunteer programs. And by creating this training and making it mandatory, they would be able to have the right context setting for the team in order to, dispel the unintended consequences of their, their initial programming. I'm going to say, please add any questions. We're about to get to Q&A, and really, in order for this to be as valuable as possible, we want to make sure that we can engage in a wonderful dialogue with all of you, either for specific examples that might be challenging, some of the barriers for why you think, well, this will never happen in my organization. Anything that comes to mind, please make sure to share it in the Q&A. But hopefully this is starting to get you to think about how you might put this into action. And so a few things that we want to share in terms of getting started. One, ask the question. If you don't even ask the question of how might we improve our language, is there language that merits being reevaluated, you'll never, be able to get to, a better place. The second one, actively seek knowledge, seek different perspectives, and think about what language are you using that might be controversial, that might merit, having a second glance. Engage your key audience, whoever this might be, your employees, your partners, your suppliers, whoever it might be that might provide you with a different, almost like a kaleidoscope, a different mirror. Review what you've heard. This goes back to one of the earlier points on, make sure also you've got different perspectives. So it could be that cross-departmental effort. And then you're never done. This is a living, breathing process. And so make sure that you, are thinking about how you might revisit this again. Some actionable takeaways briefly. Be open-minded. Language is ever evolving. Also think about what's the right decision for your organization, for what you're trying to achieve. Be intentional about how you plan to learn and explore, and also adopt any new learnings into the language that's used internally. Include your community partners or stakeholders, whoever those might be. Be consistent. There's nothing worse than, using language in one channel one way and in another a different way. And also keep it simple. Don't get overwhelmed. It's so easy to think about the complexities here. And sometimes going back to simple means that we'll actually make progress, because we will, take the necessary steps to move forward. So that is all for now. We would love to open it up to Q&A.
There is one question in the Q&A, so I'll pose that to both of you. For the anti-bias training and the volunteer program examples, who was in charge of running that training? Was it created by an internal team, or were external consultants brought in?
Great question. So this was actually spearheaded internally. Mm-hmm. So the team internally that was in charge of all of the corporate events was the one that realized, okay, there was a need to reevaluate how, internal employees were showing up, so to speak, to these massive corporate volunteer days. And they did seek outside guidance. And I think that, that's a takeaway in all of, I think, Perry, in some of your examples, and if you have another one to share, happy to have you do so. But I think that it can start internally, but having that check and having the outside perspective will make sure that whatever the evolution of language looks like, you're making sure that it's as strong as possible, whether it's, language or a training or some other program that's meant to, improve the outcome of your efforts.
Yeah, I would say it doesn't have to be external as in third party, but it has to be multidimensional. And so I was really heartened by the 67% cross-departmental, right? Because what happens is if any one department owns it or believes they owns it and tries to control it, they usually don't have enough of the diverse perspective in order to land something that's really going to work across the entire organization. Yep.
I also have a question that I think some of our audience might find helpful is, do you have any tips or suggestions for those who may run into some resistance when working across departments? Like, I'm particularly thinking about, how our members often work with marketing. How do you get over that barrier for if they run into folks who are not necessarily receptive to what they're suggesting?
Yeah, I would say two things. First of all, data is going to win the day every single time, right? I mean, like particularly with marketing, but with everybody, right? We should all be data driven, evidence driven. So you have to be able to demonstrate that there is an issue, right? And it doesn't have to be, like some of it can be qualitative data, quantitative data. There's lots of different types of ways to get data. But the other thing I just want to say, because I know sometimes we give marketing a hard time, because sometimes they're hard. But the truth is, like in Save the Children, like I think this was as much driven by marketing as all of the other components of the organization, because they could see, when you look at NGO advertisements, right, or our communication, the idea of like showing, particularly in our case, like, a pathetic child, right? Like what it's like, okay, that has a lot of emotion, but it's like, is that really respectful of is that really what we want to communicate? I think marketing was as much the identifier of the need for change as the other departments. And again, there were multiple, this change in lexicon and in belief needed to happen. It needed to happen in the programming team. It needed to happen in the marketing materials. It needed to happen in employment. It needed to happen in leadership, management, day-to-day. What I said earlier, like if there's like a takeaway that really I think also matters is your purpose, whatever the words are, your purpose is what you do and what you say every day. Like that's how your purpose lives. And I'll take it back. Sorry, what you communicate, not just say, because it's also what is visual and all the other ways communication happens that are nonverbal. But this is what your purpose is. So I think everyone has a collective interest in trying to get it right if you're aligned in what you're trying to drive as outcomes.
And I'll just add to that. I love the idea, it's like if you start and end with data, it's foolproof. And, another point to add is, regardless of what department you're in, partnering with communications or marketing, I would just talk about what is the outcome that we're trying to achieve, because it doesn't really matter what your functional expertise is. As a company, as an organization, you're trying to achieve the same thing. And so being able to, work cross-departmentally successfully, I think it starts and stops with we all want to achieve X. And now I want to bring to the table why, this type of language or how we're communicating this thing is actually not helping us achieve X to the greatest extent. And if you're doing that with an eye towards, we have the same goal in mind, you're going to be much more, you will get a more friendly reaction to want to partner with you because you have, a similar outcome in mind. It's the same outcome.
It sounds like a great tip, and I think it might answer the question that was just popped into the Q&A. How do you recommend that this approved language be embedded throughout the organization so that everyone is speaking with a consistent lexicon?
So in terms of rollout, so I think that rollout, it goes back to this has to be seen as a priority at the senior level, right? And it doesn't mean that everybody in the senior level has to do the work. It means once you've identified you have a likely issue, that everybody, whoever does the work, that when the answer comes back to the top, it has to be embraced, right? And so you think about where I always started, I believe so much in focus, right? You can't do everything, you can't boil the ocean. So start with the places, and that may be functional, that may be geographic, that may be a level within the organization, but start with the places where you're going to get the biggest impact by making the change fastest, right? So in our case, marketing embracing it right off the bat, programmatic embracing it right off the bat, right? So we brought it back to the SLT, it's agreed, now everyone is moving forward, and in terms of rollout, It's over time, because you're not going to also pay to change every asset everywhere. I mean, think about all of the assets any organization might have that have the old language, for lack of a better term, the old language on them. You can't change everything in one day, right? Nobody could afford to, and it doesn't make sense. So it's how do you begin and recognize it's a journey, because as Leeatt said, it's never over, right? You're going to get done this, but society is a living, breathing thing. What we thought was right, I'll give you just another, very personal example. So one of my really good friends in Annapolis happens to be a 77-year-old Black woman, right? And when I refer to her as a Black woman, she goes, "I'm not Black, I'm colored," right? Because when she grew up, colored was the phrase, and she doesn't want to be called Black, right? And she's not African-American either. She is very clear who she is. She is colored. So when you think about that, how many of us, if you're over 50, how many of us went through periods of time where it's like you are trying to say the right thing, and it's changed like 4 times in my lifetime, right? Society's going to keep doing that. Well, hopefully we're going to keep getting better, right? Like that's the hope, as we figure this out. But it's going to keep evolving, and therefore you're never done, and the assets will always be in kind of progress. But you've got to pick your battles. You've got to figure out where's the most impact, where's the most acute issue, or the best upside.
Yeah,
that's great. It's a great way to end the program, because I think we are at time. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank both of you for sharing your wisdom, your expertise. This is a very important topic for our community and for our organization as well. I personally learned a lot today, so thank you so much. Before people sign off, I do ask all participants to take our session survey. It's very short. It's 4 questions. It'll take you just a minute. Please take out your phones and use the QR code. We also have just dropped the link in the chat, because your feedback is very important to us, and it helps us continue to build valuable programs in the future. So with that, I thank you all for participating today, and I look forward to seeing you at a future ACCP event.
thank you.
Thank you all. A pleasure.